Don't touch him." The voice came from the porch behind her. The widow froze with the lantern in her hand, kneeling beside the man bleeding in the snow. The rancher from the neighboring land stood in the doorway, shotgun resting against his shoulder, his breath smoking in the cold night air. He stared at the wounded stranger lying beside her boots. "You know what he is," the rancher said quietly. The widow looked down again at the man. His buckskin shirt was soaked with blood, and the eagle feather tied into his braid left little doubt about his people. Apache. In this valley, that word carried the weight of every old story the townsmen still repeated around their fires. The rancher stepped down from the porch slowly. "If the town finds him here," he said, "they won't ask questions first." The widow didn't answer. She slipped one arm beneath the stranger's shoulders and tried to lift him. The rancher stared at her as if she had just done something impossible to understand. "You're going to bring him inside?" he asked. She nodded once. The man groaned softly as they moved him. His eyes opened for a moment, dark and sharp despite the blood loss, and he looked straight at her as if trying to understand why she was helping him. Then the strength left him again, and his head dropped back against her shoulder. Together they dragged him across the frozen yard and into the cabin. Inside, the widow cut open the buckskin shirt and revealed the wound beneath it. The bullet had passed through his side, but left a deep tear that still bled slowly. The rancher watched from the wall, his jaw tight. "You know this won't stay quiet," he said. But the widow washed the wound with warm water and wrapped the cloth around his ribs. Her hands never trembled. "Storm's covering the trail," she said finally. The rancher stepped toward the window and looked out at the falling snow. The wind had begun to howl across the valley, swallowing the road and every hoofprint that led to the ranch. He turned back toward the wounded man lying beside the fire. The stranger's breathing had steadied slightly, but the fever already burned in his skin. "Even if the storm hides him," the rancher said slowly, "someone will come looking." The widow placed another log on the fire and sat beside the wounded warrior. Outside, the wind roared harder across the plains. Neither of them knew it yet, but beyond the ridge, a group of Apache riders had already begun following the trail that led directly toward the widow's cabin. The wounded Apache opened his eyes just before dawn, and the first thing he saw was the widow sitting beside the fire, watching him breathe. She had not slept. The cloth around his ribs was already dark again, where the blood had slowly seeped through during the night. When he tried to move, the pain hit him hard enough to steal the air from his lungs. The widow leaned forward immediately and pressed a steady hand against his shoulder. "Don't," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but the firmness in it left no room for argument. The warrior studied her face for a long moment as if trying to understand why he was still alive. Men like him did not wake up inside settler cabins with wounds cleaned and bandaged. Finally he spoke, his voice rough and low from the cold. "Why?" The question hung in the room, and the widow poured water into a tin cup and lifted it to his lips. "You were dying in the snow," she answered. "That seemed reason enough." Across the cabin, the rancher shifted his weight against the wall where he had been standing since sunrise, arms folded, eyes never leaving the stranger. "You understand where you are," he said quietly. The Apache warrior looked toward him without fear. "I know." The rancher pushed away from the wall and stepped closer to the firelight. "Then you know the town won't care why she helped you." The warrior's expression stayed steady. "They will only see who you are." The widow tied the cloth tighter around the wound, and the warrior inhaled sharply but did not cry out. His eyes returned to her. "You should have left me there," he said. She shook her head once. No. The rancher moved toward the window and brushed frost from the glass with his sleeve. Snow still drifted across the yard, but the storm had begun to weaken. Beyond the pasture, the ridgeline cut across the pale gray morning sky. He stared at it for several seconds before speaking again. "Storm covered most of the tracks," he said slowly, "but not all of them." The Apache warrior understood immediately. His people would follow the trail. The rancher kept watching the ridge, and then his body stiffened slightly. "Too late," he muttered. The widow stepped beside him and looked out across the valley. At first she saw nothing but blowing snow and bare trees. Then one dark shape moved against the white ridge. Another appeared beside it. Riders. 5 of them. They sat perfectly still on their horses, high above the ranch, yet watching the cabin below like silent shadows against the sky. The widow felt the air leave her chest as she realized what it meant. The Apache warrior slowly turned his head towards the window. Even wounded and barely able to stand, the moment he saw the figures on the ridge, his eyes changed. Those men were not strangers. They were his tribe. The riders did not move for several minutes, and the silence inside the cabin felt heavier than the storm had been. The widow kept her eyes on the ridge, while the rancher slowly reached for the rifle resting beside the door. He did not raise it. He only held it across his hands while studying the 5 figures above the valley. The Apache warrior pushed himself slightly upright beside the fire and watched them as well. Even from that distance, he knew the way they sat their horses and the way their silhouettes held still against the wind. They were warriors. They had come fast and hard through the storm to follow his trail. The rancher spoke without turning around. "If they ride down here angry, this place turns into a battlefield before noon." The widow did not answer. Her eyes were fixed on the ridge. One of the riders moved first, but his horse stepped forward slowly and began descending the long, snowy slope toward the ranch. The others followed without hurry. 5 riders spread out across the white hillside like shadows sliding down the land. The rancher tightened his grip on the rifle. "You know them?" he asked quietly. The Apache warrior nodded once. "Yes." His voice held no fear. The widow glanced at him. "Are they coming to fight?" she asked. The warrior looked towards the window again and studied the riders as they came closer through the drifting snow. For a moment he said nothing. Then he shook his head slowly. "They are coming to see if I still breathe." Outside, the riders continued down the ridge. Their horses stepped carefully through the snow until they reached the frozen creek below the ranch. From there, the cabin and barn stood clearly in view. But the lead rider stopped his horse and raised one hand slowly into the air. It was not a signal of attack. It was a signal asking for peace. The rancher noticed it immediately. His shoulders loosened slightly, though he kept the rifle near his chest. "Looks like they're giving us a choice," he said quietly. The widow opened the cabin door before either man could stop her. Cold air rushed inside, but she stepped out onto the porch without hesitation. The riders waited where they were, their horses calm beneath them. The lead warrior dismounted first. He walked forward alone through the snow until he stood a few yards from the porch steps. His face showed the same dark braids and eagle feathers as the wounded man inside. He looked past the widow and towards the cabin door. His voice was deep but steady when he spoke. "We followed his blood through the storm." The widow nodded once. "He's alive." The warrior closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of those words. When he opened them again, he looked directly at her. "You saved him." It was not a question. Behind him, the other 4 riders remained silent on their horses, watching the cabin and the rancher standing just inside the doorway. For a long moment, the valley held its breath. The warrior stepped 1 pace closer to the porch and spoke again, his voice calm but powerful enough to carry across the yard. "You helped an Apache when no one else would?" He paused, studying the widow's face carefully. "Now my people will remember your house." The lead Apache warrior remained standing in the snow for several seconds after speaking, his eyes steady on the widow, as if weighing something deeper than simple gratitude. Behind him, the other riders stayed mounted and silent, their horses shifting gently in the cold wind. The rancher stepped onto the porch beside the widow, the rifle still resting in his hands, but lowered now, not aimed at anyone. He studied the man in front of him carefully. "You came a long way through a storm for one man," the rancher said. The Apache warrior nodded once. "He is not only a warrior," he replied. "He is the son of our chief." The rancher's eyes flickered slightly at that. Inside the cabin, the wounded man stirred near the fire, hearing the voices outside. The widow glanced back toward the door, or then returned her attention to the Apache standing before her. "He can't travel yet," she said quietly. "The bullet tore through his side. If he rides now, he won't survive the night." The warrior absorbed those words without surprise. He had seen enough wounds in his life to know the truth when he heard it. Snow drifted slowly between them as the wind softened across the valley. Finally, he spoke again. "Then we will wait." The rancher looked past him toward the 4 riders still on horseback. "All of you?" he asked. The Apache warrior shook his head slightly. "No." He turned and spoke a few quiet words in his own language toward the riders. 2 of them immediately turned their horses and rode back toward the ridge, disappearing into the white hills they had come from, where the remaining 2 dismounted and led their horses toward the barn without a word. The rancher watched the movement with cautious eyes. "You trust us a lot for a man who just found his chief's son bleeding on someone else's floor," he said. The warrior looked back toward the cabin. "Trust is not the word," he answered calmly, "but the storm tells the truth about people." He nodded toward the widow. "She could have left him in the snow." The rancher followed the warrior's gaze toward her. She stood quietly beside the porch rail, the wind tugging loose strands of hair across her face. For a moment no one spoke. Then the warrior stepped closer to the porch steps. "May I see him?" he asked. The widow opened the door and stepped aside without hesitation. The warrior entered slowly, but his eyes adjusting to the warmth of the cabin after the bitter cold outside. The wounded Apache lay propped against a folded blanket near the fire, watching the doorway. The moment the 2 men saw each other, the air inside the room changed. The warrior walked forward and knelt beside him. They spoke quietly in their own language, voices low but intense. The rancher and widow stood near the door, unable to understand the words but clearly seeing the relief in both men's faces. After a moment, the warrior rose and turned back toward the widow. His expression was no longer guarded. It carried something closer to respect. "He will live," the warrior said. The widow nodded slightly. The warrior looked around the cabin, taking in the fire, the blankets, and the careful bandage around the wound. Then his voice grew serious again. "But the valley will not stay quiet when they learn where he is." The rancher understood exactly what he meant. News traveled fast in frontier towns, especially when fear was involved, and nothing stirred fear faster than the word Apache whispered between neighbors. The warrior stepped back toward the door and looked once more at the widow. "Before the sun sets," he said quietly, "someone from your town will ride here asking questions. He paused briefly before finishing the thought. And they will not come alone. The first rider from town arrived before noon, exactly as the Apache warrior had warned. The sound of hooves came fast along the frozen road, and the rancher stepped outside before the horse even reached the gate. The man riding it was one of the town deputies, a young rider whose face still carried the nervous hardness of someone trying to prove himself. He pulled the horse to a stop near the porch and looked past the rancher toward the cabin door. Then his eyes shifted to the Apache horses tied beside the barn. His expression changed immediately. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," he said. The rancher answered calmly. "You should say what you came to say." The deputy hesitated only a moment before speaking. "People in town saw tracks heading this direction this morning. When said it looked like Apache riders." He pointed toward the barn without even trying to hide the suspicion in his voice. "Looks like they were right." The rancher didn't move. "And what if they were?" The deputy glanced toward the cabin again. "Then the sheriff's riding out with half the town behind him." Inside the cabin, the widow had heard every word through the thin wooden walls. The wounded Apache sat propped near the fire, breathing stronger now but still pale from the blood he had lost. The warrior who had come down from the ridge stood near the window, watching the yard. His eyes moved slowly across the pasture where the deputy waited outside. "It begins," he said quietly. The widow looked at him. "You knew this would happen?" The warrior nodded once. "Our fear travels faster than truth." The rancher stepped back into the cabin a moment later and closed the door behind him. "Sheriff's coming," he said simply. The wounded Apache lifted his head slightly. "How many?" The rancher gave a short breath. "Enough to think they're brave." Outside, the deputy shifted uneasily in the saddle while the wind pushed snow across the yard. 20 minutes later, the sound of more horses rolled across the valley. This time it was not a single rider. Dust and snow rose together along the road as a group of men approached the ranch. The sheriff rode at the front, his gray coat pulled tight against the cold, a dozen townsmen following close behind him with rifles across their saddles. They slowed as they reached the yard, and the sheriff raised a hand for the others to hold their horses. His eyes moved across the ranch carefully, taking in the Apache horses tied near the barn and the quiet cabin sitting at the center of the land. The rancher stepped forward to meet him halfway across the yard. The sheriff stopped his horse a few yards away and studied him in silence before speaking. "We're hearing strange stories this morning," the sheriff said. "Stories about an Apache warrior bleeding in your neighbor's cabin." The rancher looked back towards the porch, where the widow now stood watching the gathering crowd. Then he turned to face the sheriff again. "What kind of man rides across a valley with rifles before he knows the truth?" The sheriff's eyes hardened slightly. "The kind who's responsible for keeping the town alive." Behind him, the townsmen shifted in their saddles, with their eyes fixed on the cabin door, as if expecting something dangerous to step out of it at any moment. Inside that cabin, the wounded Apache warrior slowly pushed himself onto his feet, despite the pain in his side. The other Apache warrior watched him carefully, but did not try to stop him. The widow realized what he intended before he even reached the door. "You can't face them like this," she said quietly. The wounded man looked at her, his expression calm and steady despite the storm waiting outside. "If I hide," he said, "they will blame you." Then he opened the door and stepped out into the cold air where the entire town was waiting. The cabin door opened slowly, and every rifle in the yard lifted a few inches higher. The wounded Apache stepped out into the cold light, one hand resting against the porch rail to steady himself. The cloth around his ribs showed a faint stain where the wound had begun to bleed again, but he stood straight despite it. The sheriff's horse shifted uneasily when it saw him. For a moment, no one spoke. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath. The townsmen had expected fear or anger or a sudden attack. Instead, the warrior simply stood there beside the widow's cabin like a man who had already accepted whatever came next. The rancher moved slightly closer to the porch, but did not stand in front of him. He only remained close enough that the message was clear. The sheriff studied the warrior carefully before speaking. "Oh, looks like the stories were true," he said. His voice carried across the yard in a calm tone that barely hid the tension underneath it. "You rode a long way to end up bleeding on a settler's floor." The Apache warrior met his gaze without flinching. "I rode through a storm," he answered quietly. "The bullet came before the snow." One of the townsmen behind the sheriff spat into the dirt. "Doesn't matter how it happened," the man muttered loudly. "What matters is what he is." The widow heard the words and stepped forward onto the porch beside the warrior. The sheriff noticed the movement immediately. His eyes shifted from the Apache to her. "You're the one who brought him inside," he said. It wasn't a question. The widow nodded once. "He was dying." A murmur moved through the group of riders. Several of them exchanged uneasy glances. What helping a wounded man was one thing. Helping an Apache warrior was another. The sheriff leaned forward slightly in the saddle. "You understand the kind of trouble that decision brings," he said. The widow did not look away from him. "I understand what kind of person leaves someone to freeze in the snow." The words settled over the yard like a challenge. The rancher watched the sheriff carefully, waiting to see how he would answer it. The sheriff took a slow breath and glanced toward the ridge beyond the pasture. The other Apache warrior stood there now near the barn, silent and watchful beside the two horses tied to the fence. The sheriff's eyes returned to the wounded man on the porch. "You got people out there waiting," he said. "Your tribe came looking." The warrior nodded. "They came because they thought I was dead." The sheriff studied him for another moment. Then his voice lowered slightly. "The town thinks something else," he said. "They think your people are gathering for a fight." The wounded Apache shook his head once. "My people came for one man," he said calmly. "Me." One of the townsmen laughed harshly behind the sheriff. "Yeah? And we're supposed to just believe that?" The warrior's eyes shifted toward the man, but his voice stayed steady. "You already know the truth," he said. "You came here because you were afraid." The rancher saw several men tighten their grip on their rifles after hearing that. Fear had always been the spark that started violence in frontier towns. The sheriff lifted a hand slightly to quiet them. His eyes stayed fixed on the Apache warrior. "Maybe we did come because of fear," he admitted slowly. "But fear makes people do things they don't always regret later." The silence that followed was heavy. The widow could feel the moment balancing on the edge of something dangerous. Then the wounded Apache warrior spoke again, his voice calm but carrying across the entire yard. "Then today you decide what kind of men you are." No one moved after the warrior finished speaking. The wind drifted slowly across the yard, pushing thin sheets of snow between the horses, while the men stared at the figure standing on the porch. The sheriff studied him for several long seconds, the kind of silence that usually came just before someone made a dangerous decision. One of the townsmen finally broke it. "This is foolish," the man said loudly from the back of the group. "We ride out here with half the town because an Apache gets shot and suddenly we're supposed to feel sorry for him?" Several riders shifted in agreement. The rancher saw their hands tightening around their rifles. He stepped forward until he stood clearly between the porch and the group of men. "He didn't ask for your sympathy," the rancher said calmly. "He just didn't want the woman who saved him punished for it." The sheriff glanced at the widow standing beside the warrior. Her expression had not changed since the men arrived. She looked tired but steady, like someone who had already accepted the consequences of her decision. The sheriff turned back toward the rancher. "You know how this valley works," he said quietly. "People don't forget old wars easily." The rancher nodded once. "That's the problem." The wounded Apache remained standing despite the pain building in his side. He could feel the blood beginning to push slowly against the bandage beneath his coat, but he ignored it. His eyes stayed on the sheriff. "If you came for a fight," he said calmly, "you would already be shooting." The sheriff almost smiled at that. "You're not wrong." The man who had spoken earlier rode his horse forward 2 steps, anger burning in his face. "We shouldn't be standing here talking at all," he snapped. "We should finish what someone already started." He lifted his rifle slightly, as if to prove his point. The movement was small, but it shifted the entire yard instantly. The rancher's body stiffened. The Apache warrior near the barn straightened beside his horse. Even the sheriff's horse tossed its head nervously. The widow stepped forward before anyone else could move. She walked down the porch steps and stopped halfway between the rancher and the group of townsmen. The wind caught her coat and pulled it back slightly as she faced the rifles pointed in her direction. "If someone shoots today," she said quietly, "it will be because you chose it." Her voice was not loud, but every man in the yard heard it clearly. The angry townsman hesitated. He had expected fear, not calm. The sheriff raised a hand again. "Lower the rifle," he said firmly. The man hesitated another second before slowly easing the weapon down. The sheriff exhaled slowly and looked back toward the porch. "You're standing on dangerous ground here," he told the wounded Apache. The warrior nodded slightly. "So are you." The sheriff let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Then he turned his horse slightly and looked over the group of men behind him. "We didn't come here to start a war," he said loudly enough for all of them to hear. "We came because we thought one was already starting." The riders looked uncertain now, their earlier anger beginning to fade under the weight of the moment. The sheriff faced the porch again. "So your people can take you when you're strong enough to ride," he said to the Apache warrior. "But until then, this valley stays quiet." The rancher glanced toward the ridge, where the snow continued drifting across the hills. The tension that had hung over the ranch since morning loosened slightly for the first time. But the warrior standing beside the widow knew something the others did not yet see. Moments like this did not end with one decision. They only changed what came next. The sheriff's words had barely settled over the yard when a new sound rolled across the valley. Hooves. Fast ones. Every man in the group turned toward the road at the same moment. A single rider burst through the drifting snow, pushing his horse hard across the pasture toward the ranch house. The animal was lathered and breathing hard, as if it had been driven without rest. The rider pulled the reins sharply and slid from the saddle before the horse had even stopped moving. It was the same deputy who had arrived earlier that morning. His face was pale, and his breath came in quick bursts as he rushed toward the sheriff. "Sheriff," he said, barely catching the air in his lungs. "More riders." The yard stiffened instantly. The sheriff's hand moved slowly toward the pistol at his belt. "From where?" he asked. The deputy turned and pointed toward the distant ridge beyond the frozen creek. At first the men saw nothing but drifting snow and pale sky. Then shapes began to appear along the horizon. Not 5 this time. A long line of riders moved slowly across the ridge, spreading out across the hilltop like shadows crossing the land. Even from that distance, their numbers were clear. The widow felt her stomach tighten as she counted them. 10. Maybe more. The rancher stepped forward and looked carefully across the valley. The wounded Apache warrior remained still on the porch beside her. His expression did not change, but the look in his eyes grew heavier. The sheriff spoke first. "Those your people?" The warrior nodded once. They came because they believed I had been killed. The sheriff watched the riders forming along the ridge, but none of them rushed forward. None of them raised weapons. They simply waited, their horses standing quiet against the white hillside. It looked less like an attack and more like a gathering of witnesses. The angry townsman who had argued earlier shifted uneasily in his saddle. "That's not 5 riders coming to check on a wounded man," he muttered. "That's a tribe preparing for trouble." The rancher shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "That's a tribe making sure no one finishes what someone else started." The sheriff studied the ridge carefully before speaking again. "Looks like we've got ourselves a valley full of people who don't trust each other." The wounded Apache stepped down from the porch, despite the pain pulling at his side. The widow reached for his arm, but he gently moved past her. He walked forward until he stood alone in the open snow between the cabin and the line of townsmen. Every eye followed him. The sheriff's voice lowered slightly. "You shouldn't be walking with that wound." The warrior stopped a few steps ahead of the rancher and looked toward the ridge where his people waited. "If they see rifles raised," he said calmly, "they will ride." The sheriff glanced behind him at the men gripping their weapons nervously. Then he looked back toward the Apache standing alone in the snow. The moment balanced again on the edge of something dangerous. The warrior lifted one hand slowly and held it high in the air toward the riders on the ridge. It was a signal, not for war, for patience. The riders did not move. The valley remained silent. For the first time since the town had arrived at the ranch, both sides were waiting for the same thing, a decision. The Apache warrior's hand remained raised in the cold air, steady despite the pain burning through his side. The riders on the ridge watched him carefully, their horses standing quiet beneath them. In the yard below, every townsman seemed to be waiting for someone else to move first. The sheriff slowly turned his horse and looked along the line of men who had ridden with him from town. Some held their rifles tight against their saddles. Others looked uncertain now, their earlier anger fading under the weight of the moment unfolding before them. The sheriff knew what they were thinking. If even one shot was fired, the riders on the ridge would come down the hill like a storm. And when that happened, the valley would burn before sunset. The wounded Apache lowered his hand slowly and turned back toward the sheriff. Even weakened, and even pale from blood loss, he carried himself with the calm of someone who had already made peace with whatever came next. The sheriff studied him carefully. "You're trusting us a lot for a man who could barely stand an hour ago," the sheriff said quietly. The warrior answered without hesitation. "I'm trusting the woman who saved me." The sheriff's eyes shifted toward the widow standing near the porch. The wind lifted her coat slightly as she watched the standoff in silence. She had not asked for any of this. Yet the entire valley now balanced on a decision that had begun with her dragging a stranger out of the snow. The rancher stepped closer beside the warrior, his voice calm but firm. "You came here thinking there was going to be a fight," he told the sheriff. "Oh, now you know there doesn't have to be." The angry townsman who had argued earlier shook his head. "You're all forgetting what these people have done," he snapped. "We let one Apache stay, and next thing you know, the whole tribe's camping outside our town." The sheriff turned slowly in the saddle and fixed the man with a hard look. "Enough." The single word cut through the tension like a blade. The man fell silent immediately. The sheriff faced the porch again, where the widow stood beside the cabin door. Then he looked at the Apache warrior standing in the snow before him. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally he took his hand off the pistol at his belt and let it rest loosely on his thigh. "You'll stay here until you can ride," he said to the warrior. "After that, your people take you home." The murmurs behind him started instantly, but the sheriff raised a hand, and they died just as quickly. "And no one in this valley," he continued firmly, "lays a hand on the woman who saved your life." The rancher nodded slowly. The widow exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Across the pasture, the riders on the ridge remained still, but the tension in their posture eased slightly, as if they understood the meaning of what had just been said. The Apache warrior looked at the sheriff for several seconds before speaking again. His voice was calm, but carried across the entire yard. "Your valley will remember this day." The sheriff gave a small nod. "So will yours." The wind drifted quietly across the snow between them. For the first time since the storm had begun, but the valley felt like it might survive the morning without blood on the ground. But the warrior knew something deeper had already changed. The moment the sheriff chose peace over fear, the story of this valley would travel far beyond its frozen hills. The sheriff's decision settled over the valley like the final moment of a storm breaking apart. For several seconds, no one moved. The men from town shifted uneasily in their saddles, unsure how to respond now that the fight they had prepared for had quietly slipped away from them. The angry townsman looked as if he wanted to argue again, but the sheriff's silence warned him not to. Slowly, one by one, the rifles lowered. The wounded Apache warrior remained standing in the snow, the wind pulling softly at his coat while he studied the men who had come ready to judge him. His breathing was heavier now. The effort of standing had pushed the strength out of his body again, but he refused to show it. The widow stepped down from the porch and came to his side, gently placing a steady hand beneath his arm. This time he did not resist the help, but the sheriff watched the small movement carefully. "Get him back inside," he said quietly. "If he falls over out here, the town will say I let him die." A few of the men laughed awkwardly, the sound breaking the tension that had held the yard all morning. The rancher guided the warrior back toward the porch while the widow opened the door. Before stepping inside, the warrior turned one last time toward the ridge. His people were still there, silent and watchful against the pale sky. The sheriff followed his gaze. He lifted his hat slightly toward the distant riders, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than authority. After a moment, the Apache riders began turning their horses away from the ridge one by one. They did not rush. They simply rode back across the hills the same way they had come, disappearing slowly into the white distance. But the valley watched them go. When the last rider vanished beyond the ridgeline, the sheriff turned his horse back toward the road. "We're done here," he said to the men behind him. One by one, the townsmen wheeled their horses around and began riding back toward town. None of them spoke as they left. The ranch yard grew quiet again, the wind pushing light snow across the empty ground where the standoff had taken place. Inside the cabin, the Apache warrior sat once more beside the fire, while the widow tightened the bandage around his ribs. The rancher stood by the door, glancing occasionally toward the road as the last of the riders disappeared from sight. After a moment, the warrior looked up at the widow. "Your valley almost chose fear today," he said quietly. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Almost," she answered. Outside, the storm clouds were finally beginning to break apart, and pale sunlight touched the frozen hills beyond the ranch. The rancher stepped out onto the porch and watched the valley stretching quietly beneath the morning sky. The snow still covered everything, but the tracks left behind told a story that would travel far beyond this land. A widow had saved a wounded Apache warrior. A town had ridden out, ready for war. And for once, the valley had chosen something else instead. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted frontier stories on Echoes of the West. If you had been standing in that snowy valley when the town arrived with rifles, would you have chosen fear like the crowd, or courage like the widow who opened her door? Tell us in the comments.